So most of the concepts we talk about involve you in a heads-up situation, right? So a lot of poker today, you'll find heads-up pots, but you're also going to find yourself in a lot of multi-way pots where there's 3 people in the hand to as many as 8 or 9. And it's very important to notice that everything changes, frankly, from how often you should continuation bet to how strong your hand needs to be to continue against a bet, the average strength of the winning hand by the river, the likelihood of someone hitting the flop. All that changes drastically, and we have to adjust our frequencies accordingly. So for example, if there's 7-way pot and the flop comes 7, 8, 9 of hearts, and you have ace, king of spades is a very pretty hand. It is no longer worth a penny. It is no longer worth anything. You just can chuck that hand in and don't want to waste any chips trying to bluff at a 7, 8, 9 of hearts flop. You'll hear the term, if you've watched poker on television, you'll hear the term polarized a lot. And essentially what that means is, a bet, for example, after the flop is going to be sometimes polarized, where it's like either this player has like a really, really strong hand or absolutely nothing. It means basically that they're not usually betting the middle hands. Now, typically, the more players in a pot, when you're dealing with a multi-way situation, the more polarized the bets are going to be. You're rarely going to see people betting the marginal hands, but they're going to bet the better hands, and occasionally you'll see the bluffs. But really, I wouldn't even just describe it as polarized. It's just way stronger, right? Because overall, if you're betting into 7 people, you just need to have a stronger hand, because by the river, the average hand that you're going to win with is much stronger when there's many people in a pot. So obviously, in multi-way pots, people's ranges are much more honest. They're not going to be bluffing as often, and that holds true even more so when you're talking about a player in a short stack. So imagine the pot is 2,000 after a bunch of limps, and a player goes all in for like his last 400. Like, he's not bluffing. He clearly likes something on that board. Otherwise, probably would have went check fold. So you can extrapolate information from stack size as well as multi-way, being that the ranges are going to be more honest, and especially when you combine both of them, then you can just assume that that player who's betting his last chips is going to have something that at least has some equity going forward past the flop. So as we've established, when you're in a multi-way pot, you want to be bluffing less, but not 0% necessarily, because if you're bluffing 0%, guess what? Now everyone knows when you bet, you have a super strong hand. So what you want to incorporate into your bluffing range here is what we call semi-bluffs. So semi-bluffs are bets on the come, where you have an open-end straight draw. You flopped 4 spades. You've got, something along those lines where you have some equity and some out. So that, accompanied with your strong hands, is enough in a multi-way pot to give you enough texture and balance to your betting range. Because again, obviously everyone knows, well, you bet into 7 players, you're more likely to have a strong hand than if you just bet into 1 or 2 players. Some of the time in multi-way pots, you can use another player and their tendencies to get the best hand out and play against the worst hand. There's an example of this I played in a show recently where we were playing in a cash game, and the flop came Queen Jack 3. It was checked to me, and I bluffed with 5, 6 of diamonds. I didn't really have anything. I just thought it was a good spot to bluff. The player in the small blind is a very good player, and he called. And then the other player who limped in late position also called. So I felt like the player on my immediate left, the strong player, he probably had a pair of jacks or maybe a queen or something along those lines. Now the turn card was a 5, which paired me, which isn't exactly, going to be the best hand. However, I thought there's a very good chance that the player in the small blind has me beat with a jack or a queen, and the other player could have a draw. So my pair of 5s is ahead of the draw, but not ahead of the pair of queens or jacks. So in this situation, what I did was I made a pretty large bet, a pretty substantial bet, to put this player in the middle. So this player now has to worry about my bet, and he also has to worry about the other player behind him, which puts a lot more pressure and stress on him. So in this situation, what happened was that player did fold the pair, and the other player called with the draw, missed the draw, and I won the pot in a spot where I wouldn't have won the pot. So it's a situation where I pushed the best hand out to play with the draw and make my second best hand the winner. So one of the interesting things that happens when you're in multi-way pots is people play what I call more true, right? So when they have a hand, they're usually going to bet it, and they're not going to slow play as often because there's 6 or 7 way action. So when you're in position, this actually can open up some situations where your bluffs could work a little more often. Reason being, if 6 people already checked to you and they all had an opportunity to bet, if they would have had something pretty good, chances are they would have bet. So if you do bet in position, again, it's never a good idea to do a lot of bluffing in multi-way pots, but sometimes when you have all that added information of 6 people checking, you can bet there. And if you're not check raised, you can essentially assume that the range you're up against is capped. And you know what that means. If their range is capped, they can't have that strong a hand. You potentially could. So it's an opportunity where maybe you could fire a second barrel and even a triple barrel bluff in a spot like that. But the fact that you're in position means that you should probably bluff more than you certainly should from early position. If you're in the small blind in a 7-way pot, you bluffing at it on the flop is just a disaster. You have no idea what's going to happen behind you or have any information on what players have. So not ideal. You want to be in position if you're going to bluff multi-way. So let's say you're in a situation where you're in a multi-way pot and you have like a nutted hand and there's like 7 or 8 players versus having that nutted hand against 1 player. Well, let me ask you, which situation do you think you'll likely extract more value from? Well, it just makes logical sense that the more players in the hand, the more likely at least 1 or 2 of them has flopped something that they like. So when you do have a nutted hand in a multi-way pot, your likelihood of getting action and your equity is going to be a lot stronger and a lot better, especially at lower limit poker where you're going to see most of the multi-way pots. Now, in a heads-up pot, you're talking about typically like higher level play and, not as many opportunities to extract equity because if that 1 player doesn't have anything, well, so what? You have 4 of a kind, big deal. No one has nothing. But if there's 7 players in the pot, there's a much better chance that at least one of them will call. So what that means is that you don't really need to slow play as often in a multi-way pot. You can go ahead and say, you know what, I'm going to get value for this hand by betting, betting, betting. Heads up, you may need to be a little more crafty and tricky to extract value. Multi-way, you can be a little more honest. So we talk a lot about, putting a player on a range of hands. And, when you're in a heads-up pot, it's a lot easier to do it than it is when you're in a multi-way situation. It's not like when you're in a 7-way pot. There's a lot of value in saying to yourself, on this flop, I put this player on this range, this player on this range. What you essentially do is compare your hand to the board and sort of gauge, like, how well does my hand do in a 7-way action pot? Like, am I, with middle pair, going to rate to have the best hand often enough to continue betting here or the like? So the more players that are in the pot, the more you're like sort of steering away from trying to identify specific ranges until you see an action, right? So if you bet and you've been called now, you can start to narrow that player's range down. But you don't want to waste a lot of time and energy trying to think about what is the range of all 7 players. You think collectively, as a whole, how does my hand do against all the ranges possible? So when you're thinking about what hands to play and how to play them, the type of game that you're in and, how often 5 or 6-way action happens should really weigh into your decisions. Because some hands play much better in multi-way pots and some play better heads up. For example, if I'm in a heads up situation in position, I would rather have ace-8 offsuit than I would, 4-6 of diamonds. Put me in that same situation where there's 9 people taking a flop. The 4-6 of diamonds connects a lot better. The ace-8 is more difficult to play. If I flop an ace, I'm going to be worried about kickers and things like that. So if I had a hand like ace-8 offsuit, I would want to get that hand heads up. Whereas with 4-6 of diamonds, I'm happy to play a hand like that multi-way. So also from a value perspective, you look at little pairs, right? Now a little pair like a pair of deuces does fine heads up. Not as well 3-way or 4-way because it's so likely that overcards are going to come and you're not getting as good of a price. But if there's like 9-way action and you have a little pair of 3s, it's a fantastic hand to see a flop with because it's a hit or miss situation and very easy to play. When you're in multi-way pots, you really want to focus more on playing hands that are easier to play. So suited connectors, baby pairs, much easier than hands like ace-10 offsuit, king-10, jack-10 off. Those are hands that can get you into a lot of trouble because it's very hard to make nutted hands with them. And the great thing about the 6-7 suiteds and the pocket 3s is if you miss the flop, it's very easy to fold. There's not much of a decision to make. So depending where you are in your poker career in terms of like what stakes you play, what you'll generally see is a trend, okay? The higher the stakes, the more shorthanded it becomes in terms of how many players see a flop. So this game is supposed to be played pretty conservatively. You're not supposed to play half the hands. You're not supposed to play 35% of the hands. You should play, a lower spectrum depending on how many players are there. So what you see at lower limits often is you get 7 or 8 people just calling the bet, limping in just to see the flop. They're doing it with all kinds of hands like Jack 6 suited and, King 3 offsuit and all kinds of hands you should not be playing. So adjusting to this dynamic is very, very important depending on where you're at. So a lot of questions I get, frankly, are like people saying, how do I get up into the higher limits where they respect my raises? I can't beat these bad players. I'm like, that's not how this works. The fact that other players are playing poorly and limping a lot actually makes it easy for you. What you don't have to force anymore are mistakes by your opponents with big bluffs or anything like that. All you have to do is play fundamentally strong. You play premium hands, you value bet when you have it, you bluff a whole lot less, and you're going to get so much more value than you would at higher stakes. What happens at higher stakes? You don't see 7 or 8 way pots. You're going to see heads-up situations where you have to beat one opponent. When that's the case, the odds of one of you having the nuts decreases significantly. So it's usually the person that, can be more aggressive or set better traps that's going to get the maximum value in situations. So it's a vast difference in terms of how you want to play. When I play tournaments and I play these high roller events against all the young geniuses today, I go in there knowing that I'm going to have to force them to make mistakes in order for me to win. I can't just sit back, wait for the cards to come to me and expect to win. That's how I will play, though, if I'm playing in like a $300 buy-in tournament. I'm not going to do any bluffing. I'm just going to take advantage of the fact that people are calling too often, playing too many hands, and just giving me value in that regard. So probably one of the most difficult parts of, being a professional poker player, even recreational, is you get pocket aces and you lose. Now, the sort of the math on this and the statistics on it aren't all that understood, right? If you're in a heads-up situation against one opponent and you get all in with pocket aces, you'll win a good 80-something% of the time, right? However, the more players that enter the pot, the lower the frequency that you're actually going to hold those aces. So if you're up against 7 opponents and you have pocket aces, you're going to win less than half the time. Right? Which seems crazy to most people. Like, well, how can that be? Aces are the best hand in the deck. Well, unless you went all in before the flop, sometimes you're going to get 7 or 8 way action. And in that case, you have to be aware of the fact that just because I had aces before the flop, this isn't a situation where I automatically win, right? So a lot of people think, well, I've just got bad luck. And that's usually a case of people remembering the worst times and forgetting all the times they won. And also setting expectation that isn't realistic. If you're getting aces in a game where typically 7 or 8 people play, you should expect to lose half the time. Even in the best case scenarios, 1 out of 5 times, you're going to lose with aces. So it's really important to focus on fundamental logic, math, and reality to not allow yourself to play the game of woe is me, I'm just unlucky.